And then the last part of the cycle of grace is, Brunner and Lake call it faithfulness. I like to call it faithful obedience. Acting out of his acceptance, his sustenance, and his significance. He ministered to those around him. He gave of himself. He poured out of himself.
Buongiorno. You're listening to Going, Where God is at Work, a podcast that sits at the intersection of missions theory and practice. And we're walking at our call to ministry in faraway places, and happy to have you join us on the journey. I'm your host, Jesse Pauli, a missions leader serving in Rome, and I'm here with Alessandro Di Leonardo, a church planter in Cisterna di Latina, and Jen Williamson, our missiologist who lives and works in Lyon. Welcome back, everyone.
Howdy.
Good to be back.
Howdy.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a Pacific Northwest greeting, is it?
It definitely is not. I did grow up in Texas, though, so full disclosure.
Sure.
There
Howdy comes from my childhood roots.
That's funny. Oh, man. Well, we are excited to get into another episode of the season 3, and we're tackling the topic of burnout today. It's kind of interesting. Just bear with me for a second, guys, but we're talking about burnout. When I think of burnout, I often think of tiredness. And ever since we changed the clocks recently, I've just woken up feeling tired every single morning. Anyways, that was neither here nor there. Let's just jump right into the deep end. And how about we start with the question, have you ever experienced burnout? And could you tell us what that was like? Or how about this, when it started in ministry, like, you know, where were you at in ministry, and maybe also kind of how you got out of it, or how you made progress out of it?
For years, I don't know, I almost want to say I was proud of the fact that I didn't experience burnout. And I attributed that to the fact that we are very faithful about keeping our Sabbath. And I don't actually want to discount that or downplay that. I think consistently keeping Sabbath, having a hard stop in every week is really a good antidote to going to burnout. But what I've learned, and what I learned through my experience, is it's not enough. It's not only that. That is a big piece, but it's not only that. And for me, it came at an interesting time. It was really towards the end of COVID. So in a lot of ways, some of the ministry activity had decreased or shifted or changed, and ministry stress had gone up. So it wasn't even a place of overactivity so much as mental burdens and stress around what we were trying to accomplish in a context that was really difficult. And I was unaware. It is sort of like the proverbial frog in the boiling water. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't wake up one day fine and the next day burnt out. It's so gradual that I didn't realize I was burned out until my husband and I went on vacation. When I graduated with my doctorate, my parents gave David and I a vacation, money for a vacation. And then COVID hit, so we couldn't go on that vacation until almost 2 years later. And we were finally taking this vacation, and we were going to Zanzibar, which is, a wonderful tropical island and off of Tanzania in Africa, East Africa. And we had a 10-day vacation, really at a all-inclusive resort. Everything should have been fantastic. I did not even get to a place of enjoying or relaxing on that vacation till day 8. It took me 8 days for the cortisol levels to come down, for the stress levels to come down. I was anxious. I was not. I was kind of crying at weird things, but not really emotional. It was like stress crying. And here we were in this sunny, fantastic, beautiful location. And I couldn't even enjoy it. So I thought, it's really funny because I think sometimes people think vacation is going to be the antidote. For me, vacation was what revealed in fact, how far off and far gone I was.
Wow. So it's almost like it when you got to vacation, you're able to kind of, there's like a release of the valve and you could realize how much pressure had built up.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I think for me it was a struggle to even use the word burnout. My wife was much quicker to recognize and use that word. For me, I never liked to use that word. But yeah, we started going through just a season of just everything was feeling difficult. I think is kind of how I would describe it. Like, um, there were definitely some challenges, some real life things that happened and challenges throughout that time. But then just the mundane things would feel difficult. The things that were just supposed to do every day would just constantly just become more and more difficult. And then we started, I think, noticing more frustration between us. Um, and interesting enough, I always equated the idea of burnout with like your work life and how like much pressure you were on under work or how many hours you were putting into work. That was kind of what, but I was finding that like I actually quite enjoyed work and I wasn't feeling necessarily pressure. There's always, I think, missionaries and in general and global workers, because I think it would probably work the same statement for others that, you know, there is extra stuff you have to do because you're in a different culture. There is more hours that go into it, whether it's directly doing it or just your own like mental load and trying to disconnect from work when you get off and things like that. But for me, it was more just the realizing that like at home, there was just so much added stuff, two new kids and some health issues and stuff. It was like just the general like home life and realizing that's where I started to realize like living in a different country without a community around like a family, like without grandma or aunts and uncles, like it just really was showing me how much um, you lean on all of those people when you're in your passport country. And the saying, it takes a village, started to make more and more sense when it's like all on, the spouses. So I think for us, that was definitely a hard time. And it was after, getting through COVID and getting through, a lot of things that were pretty tough. I think one of the things that helped us in the midst of it was we put together a team, like a discernment team that were 8 people who we respected, who we looked up to in a sense, and that knew us from different areas of our life. Maybe they were from our passport country or from our mission organization, and we asked them to help us kind of discern some changes we maybe need to make. And so that was really helpful. That was just to have someone else who's outside of the situation speak in and encourage and kind of see things that we couldn't see. That was really helpful. And then I would say ever since that time, which was, I don't know, that was probably over a year now ago, we just seen steady progress of feeling a lot, better and making strides forward where things are becoming to get less difficult, I guess, in one way.
Yeah. So I actually never used the word burnout just because talking to people that I know that have gone through burnout and just like, oh yeah, definitely didn't get to there. But then like Jen, you said, something that doesn't happen in one instant. It's a journey. And so I if I was to say if I did experience burnout, it probably was more at the beginning end. But I would say it happened when we moved to Italy, when we made that shift. And maybe similarly to you, Jen, like that vacation for me, that move was when it exposed a lot of things. And so a lot of it had to do, one was the move, the fact that we decided to go into mission, as one of them was because the current ministry that I was in the States, I could tell that it was coming to an end, but I kept at it. And it was just the Lord was calling me to something else. And so it was, one was not hearing from the Lord, and then finally hearing, there was relief in there. But then moving to a different country with a newborn and it revealed a lot of things. One is not having the opportunity to do ministry right away, and so like realizing, oh, my identity was tied up a lot into the ministry. So a lot of those things that revealed things that needed to work on, that I should have worked on prior to going into missions. And then as Jesse, you mentioned, a lot of it was also home related. Obviously, if you're going to move to a different country, it's going to create some tensions in the things that maybe was easier when you were back home to do. And so some of that brought about as well, affected our marriage, affected the ministry that we were starting. And so all of that together, it was definitely a recipe for the ultimate burnout. But thankfully, God was able to intervene there. I didn't have a discernment group, but I was able to connect to a friend, a classmate who ended up becoming my mentor, and there, even through Zoom, was able to guide first me, and then having his wife involved, helping my wife, really helped us out. So yeah, we've never used the word burnout, but definitely it was a moment that we both remember vividly, and we never want to go back to.
Yeah, it's so interesting how helpful it is just to have that an outsider's perspective, someone that's, can see, because we kind of get stuck, right, in just seeing what's in front of us. But when we have other people, so one of the things we wanted to do today, as we talk about and go deeper into this concept of burnout, was kind of based off of an article that the Lausanne movement put out back in 2024. So I'm actually just going to read a section where they give kind of a what is burnout, because I think that'd be helpful for us to kind of look at as we go forward. And this is written by Billy Drum, and he writes, "Burnout among missionaries is a growing phenomenon. A Barna statistic estimates that every month approximately 1,500 North American ministry workers, so pastors and or missionaries, leave their work due in part to burnout. At a whopping $500,000 price tag for recruiting, preparing, launching, and sustaining a ministry worker on the field for the first 4 years, the cost of attrition due to burnout is astronomical. However, the cost of burnout is not only monetary. Burnout affects families, teams, supporters, friends, and the advancement of the gospel. So according to the World Health Organization, burnout is a syndrome resulting from unmanaged workplace stress. It is characterized by 3 main manifestations: exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy, acting in conjunction. Exhaustion occurs when there's a lack of physical, emotional, mental, or relational resources to cope with or complete a task. Cynicism is manifested when emotions take over, resulting in an increased negativity toward work and people related to work. Professional efficacy is diminished as a sense of ineffectiveness and a felt lack of accomplishment. Any initial reactions to that?
Well, it's interesting right away. You had mentioned, Jesse, about that it's often taught about workplace, but you had mentioned that it's not, at least in your case, and especially for like for example, like your wife, who says, we experienced burnout, but she was not at the workplace. But here, the first thing they put is workplace stress. So just interesting how I think we should expand that definition, especially since it's brought by the World Health Organization, to kind of add a spiritual spin to it.
Yeah, for sure.
I really appreciate the notation of cynicism, because I do come across that a lot in missionaries and ministry workers. And I think some of it is our personality. Some of us tend more easily towards cynicism than others. But I think it's a good thing to be aware of if wherever your starting point on the cynicism scale is, if there's an uptick in that, it might be an indicator to you, because like I said, I missed all of the signs. And I think this is a good one to pay attention to. If I find myself becoming cynical, or more cynical than would be normal, I might want to step back and think about, okay, is this a symptom for me?
Yeah, with being cynical, I think that there's the two ways of both are wrong, but there's the cynical, the one who is cynical towards outsiders. So they're like, oh, you guys are all doing it wrong. That's, but you're kind of super proud inside. I don't think that's a sign of burnout. I think it's a sign of a different problem. And then the sign of burnout is when you kind of start hating what you're doing. You kind of start being negative towards the people you're working with and stuff like that. And so.
That's a great distinction.
Yeah, or even just the idea that what you're going to do isn't going to work. Is it going to fail? Those thoughts, I think, are part of that too. And the idea of the amount of money and resources that goes into a cross-cultural worker. And obviously, their stats are heavily skewed from North American standards, just because that's where they were able to do the research. But I mean, it's weird. It almost adds another layer of pressure, because how much money has gone into getting, you over that you don't want to give up. I know that's, for me, has been something that I've been like, man, we don't want to fall into that statistic of leaving, which can cause a reverse effect, because then you're being, the competitive side is saying, okay, I'm just going to stick with it because I don't want to fall to that statistic. I know for me, that was something that when we were going through burnout, I was wrestling with. Like, my pride was wrestling with the fact, like, man, what's going to happen if I do have to go back to the States and pack up? As a man, all these ideas of what would I even do as work? Like, how am I going to provide for my family? Like, oh, I feel like a failure.
Rather than piling on the guilt or the shame in that space, though, I wonder if that statistic can help us prioritize the prevention. And I think that's what they're getting at, right? Like, we need to take seriously this idea of burnout, not just as, oh, that's just some ooey gooey thing that people talk about nowadays that doesn't really matter, and let's stick to the work, because it is about the work. And so being good stewards of our bodies and our families and our time and our emotional resources, all of that is playing into the longevity and the efficacy of the work to which we're called.
Yeah, before we jump into some preventative kind of things that we could look at, why don't we just briefly run through some of the signs that people can look at? Because someone listening to this might actually be really in the deep of burnout and not even realize it, like you were saying earlier, Jen. Or sometimes maybe it's even being misdiagnosed, quote unquote, by people just using the term, but then really it's not really a burnout situation. It's just they're tired, or they had a hard week. Or he kind of lays out, and I believe this is from the WHO, the idea of physical signs, psychological signs, and some behavioral signs. We might add in there maybe some spiritual signs that we can come up and share as we're going through. But I think some of the obvious ones are like this idea of fatigue, of just feeling tired physically. The idea of just frequent illness and headaches. Sometimes, we chalk those things up to like our environment. We say, oh, well, there's mold in the house, or there's, seasonal things, but we really should be paying attention to those things too. Like, if we're constantly sick, our body is obviously not at 100%, right? And so there could be signs of burnout.
Yeah, it's probably not any one of these symptoms, but you do want to start looking for frequency of these systems and clusters of these symptoms. Yeah. So, right, like if I'm just having headaches and none of the other symptoms, then I probably need to look at, some other cause. But if I'm having several of these things, I think then we need to step back and think, okay, and frequently, if I'm having these things frequently. I think it's interesting, things like restlessness, insomnia, heart palpitations, chest pain, or digestive issues. I mean, any of those we could have as a one-off experience, or a season, maybe even with time changes or whatever. But if these are things, that physical symptoms that are starting to be part of your regular experience, I think that's when we start paying attention. And it's interesting because I think you should look at what's unnatural for you as well. So in here, they list insomnia. I've been a chronic insomniac since I was 16. When I was going into burnout, I actually was sleeping more than I've ever slept in my life. So that's not necessarily on there, but it was a change. And probably for me, that was a symptom. So you also need to know kind of what's your normal, and then what's going on different. Yeah. Should we look at some of the psychological ones?
Well, it's interesting too. The psychological ones, like for example, anxiety, is often paired with some of those things that you just said from the physical, right? Heart palpitations,
right, exactly.
Digestive issues.
Yep. They have panic attacks. Now, I've had a season of panic attacks, but that wasn't related to burnout for me. That was a different thing. But I can see how for some people that might be a symptom there. Increased anger, frustration, irritability. That just describes me in my 30s in general. So again, you have to know yourself.
Well, I like the word increased. They used it just for anger. I feel like they should use that for all of them, because the reality is sometimes I am depressed. Sometimes I have anxiety. Sometimes I reduce enjoyment, hopelessness. I see someone in the church. I'm like, but if it's increased, right? If, as you said, Jen, like if you just like, wow, like that's constantly, it's happening often, then that should be the one of the key signs.
Right.
Yeah, as I'm looking at these, and we're talking about them, I'm just getting more and more like, oh man, yeah, it was a season of burnout. There's so many of these things that we went through that. I was hospitalized with some digestive issues. I had a panic attack. I had all of these. There's a bunch of these. I'm feeling a bit convicted. Yeah.
And it's funny because, as we've noted, any of these could be just part of a natural experience. So that's, again, why it's harder to diagnose. But I also think we do need to pay attention to those clusters, those groupings. Are more than one of these happening at a greater frequency than is normal for us, or at a more intense or increased, like Alessandro was saying, level? Yeah. And then the behavioral ones I find also very revealing, especially decreased productivity, increased absenteeism, isolation. That isolation is, I think, a big one. I think starting to kind of step back and separate yourself and remove yourself from situations, tardiness, poor team player, mood changes, job satisfaction, and then increased drug and alcohol use. I think we could look at any increased sort of soothing behaviors, self-soothing behaviors could
like
be on that list. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's not just drug and alcohol use, but anything that we find, like for me, it could be numbing myself with Netflix. It could be what are the things that we go to escape reality in any behavioral capacity. Some people might just work out, like go to the gym 2 times a day for 2 hours at a time, whatever, any of that.
Video games, lots of things that are used often to escape reality. Like all things, maybe in small doses or small quantities aren't a big problem, but it's that increase, that constant. What are what are some spiritual things that we might point to that could be another sign of burnout?
I would say definitely if you are not spending time with the Lord, that becomes much less and less, and you don't desire it. I think a lot of us find ourselves in seasons where we might not be as faithful in reading the Word and praying, but I think the difference is that we actually miss Him. Like, oh man, I should really be doing this. I want to read. Like, I'm just constantly busy. Versus I just don't miss it anymore. And I think that's a huge, a huge spiritual sign.
Yeah. I think avoiding community, avoiding being in those spaces where someone might even notice or ask a question or call into question. I think I do that almost subconsciously. I don't think, oh, I'm not going to go to small group today because I don't want anybody to say, how are you doing? But somehow I will find an excuse to not go. And underlying that is not wanting to expose or, be vulnerable. I think there's sort of a resistance even to prayer or to even receiving prayer.
Yeah, I think some things aren't necessarily warning signs. I don't know if I would say a warning sign, but I'm thinking, some of these other things, changes such as isolation or mood changes, they lead to then opportunities for sin to grow in your life, or for you to be more prone to fall into temptations that you face. We talked about the idea of gluttony and overeating or abusing alcohol or drugs, and so so I would say any of those almost are indicators of burnout happening. And I think the loss of community is probably one of the biggest factors, because when you're in community, then the idea would be that that community would be able to see things and like you said, call them into question, and or at least put an arm around and say, hey, are you doing all right? Like, I noticed this or that. And so some of that opportunity to even get out of burnout or to get out of the situation that you're in, it's like a vicious cycle, right? If you're not in community, then you don't have others that can help pull you out, and then you just kind of end up in this cycle of, for too long, leads to a lot of problems, right? So how do we get? So we're working our way back, right? We're talking about all the signs that you're in burnout. What are some things that we can do preventively, like you alluded to earlier, Jen?
So there's some research that goes way back to the 60s. A couple of, I think a Swiss guy and a British guy, Brunner and Lake are their names. We're looking into this problem. So this is, there's nothing new under the sun. This isn't some new thing that missionaries are encountering. And when they were noticing missionaries burn out, they thought, okay, wait a minute, let's look at the life of Jesus, because he had a really active, really busy, really hectic ministry schedule, but he didn't burn out. So what can we learn from the life of Jesus? And they recognized in his life what they have termed the cycle of grace. And they say, the cycle of grace begins with acceptance. So if we look at the start of Jesus' ministry, the first thing he does is he's baptized. He comes out of the water, and a voice comes down from heaven and says, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." So Jesus had the full acceptance of the Father, but at that moment in time, he hadn't performed any miracles. He hadn't healed any diseases. That acceptance just came completely separate from any work or behavior that he had done. It just was what he was in the Father. And so they would say the cycle of grace begins with understanding that full acceptance that we have in Christ. The next thing that he does is he's sent into the desert, and he's, yes, tempted, but also sustained by the angels. And they looked at the many places in Jesus' life that he was experiencing sustenance, whether through those times when he withdrew into the desert alone to pray, whether it was times that he went to Bethany and spent time with his friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, time with children, time at parties, time in worship. There were many things. Even Jesus says that doing the will of the Father was his sustenance. So there were places of sustenance built into his life. And the next thing that they saw is that he had a sense of significance. He knew who he was. His identity was secure because it was rooted in his acceptance and sustained by healthy habits. And in that identity, we see Jesus through all of the I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. He knew who he was. And again, all of that apart from any doing or activity. And then the last part of the cycle of grace is, Brunner and Lake call it faithfulness. I like to call it faithful obedience. Acting out of his acceptance, his sustenance, and his significance. He ministered to those around him. He gave of himself. He poured out of himself. And so they say if we can live in that cycle of grace, it will be an antidote against a burnout. But the challenge is, what they observed is that most missionaries were reversing the cycle. So they began with faithful obedience. I'm going to do the work of the Lord. I'm going to invest in my ministry. And in that, they found their identity. So kind of like Alessandro was talking about, when he moved over immediately and ministry wasn't available to him, he realized how much he was finding his significance was rooted in that faithful obedience and what he did. And then in order to sustain that significance, that's where we go into those unhealthy behaviors, becoming workaholics, becoming driven. We're doing something to sustain our significance. And that we do all of that in order to be accepted. And when we reverse that cycle, it is a perfect recipe for burnout, because that's not how we were made to live. And that's not who we are in Christ. And I love that if we look at when Jesus sent out the 72 and they come back and they're rejoicing and they're like, hey, we cast out demons in your name. We did all of this great stuff. And Jesus is like, 2 thumbs up. Good job, guys. But rejoice because your names are written in the book of life. He pushes them right back into that acceptance. And he even gives a warning. He says, hey, I saw Satan fall from heaven. And I used to read that passage and think, that's kind of weird. Like, why is he talking about this here? But I think what he's saying is, we knew someone who found their significance in what they were able to do. And that didn't end well. So just remember, you're able to do what you do because your name is written in the book of life. And that's where your joy and your significance has to flow out of that. So I think we could talk about ways that we can then enter into that cycle of grace. What are ways that we experience and know the acceptance of the Father? What are ways that we are sustained in that grace? And how are we significant? And I think it's okay for us to know, this is what Jen can contribute. This is who I am. This is how God made me. Those things help us move into that space of faithful obedience and not get the cycle reversed.
Yeah, that's very good, Jen. I think one way for me, at least, that helps know that I'm in the right track, that I, just as Jesus received the voice from the Lord when he was being baptized, the same, it would be amazing if I could hear the voice of the Lord. But in a more practical sense, it's great to also have leaders, mentors, people that are walking with the Lord, who can speak into your life and say, you're on the right track, you're doing well. You don't need to necessarily do this to find your worth, to remind you. And I think that's great. Just as the disciples had Jesus, to have people around you that can do that. One of the things that I wanted to share was, I remember hearing a sermon from John Piper when he was talking about Hebrews 12:1 about running the race. And he said that so many Christians focus too much on the idea of, the verse tells you to throw away anything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And he says, the people is like, okay, is this sin? Should we do this? Should we not do this? Is this okay? When you focus so much on what keeps you from running, he says, no one's asking a question, what's going to make me run faster? And so I feel like the same thing is with burnout. Like, I see it that actually the pendulum has swung, that a lot of people are so afraid of burning out that they're putting so many boundaries that then they do nothing. They're putting so many, like, okay, I got to do this. I got to do this. That might actually lead to burnout. Whereas, like, what's actually going to make me run faster without burning out? What's actually going to make me last longer without burning out? So asking more positive questions, and this is not just an individual question, this is an organizational question. How can we better empower our missionaries so that they can run and they can last longer, instead of them burning out?
I love that, Alessandro. I'm wondering too if that ties into that significance piece, because when I'm trying to emulate someone else's way of doing ministry or someone else's giftings, or even copy a method that my mission organization is saying is the way I need to work, if I'm not confident in who I am in Christ, and if I don't understand how he made me, I'm not going to be able to tailor those things to say, um, and this is again where the healthy boundaries can come in, right? So, not the boundaries that say, oh, I'm going to self protect, but the boundaries that say, I'm a limited human and these limitations are given to me by God. And so, I'm going to work within the limitations that God has given me to cooperate, running the race set before me versus just the throwing off the sin piece.
Yeah, it's interesting as you were talking. Alessandra, I was thinking about recently. So full disclosure, I've never ran a marathon, not a half marathon. I think I did a 5K maybe once. I don't know, but I was sitting in. I got breakfast with a couple guys who run marathons, and the one guy who was a little more mature and had ran more marathons was trying to prep the younger guy who hasn't ran as many marathons, let's say. And it was so interesting to listen into how he was coaching him. And he was telling him, like, okay, you're going to run, you're going to start off with the group, and then you're going to want to start to speed up. And he was coaching him along the whole, and you could just see he was visualizing the race that he was going to run. And he said, okay, when you get around this corner, it's a long stretch and it's boring. And so when it's boring, you're going to want to push hard and hard. He's like, actually, that's where you need to pace yourself. That's where you need to find the right timing. And then you're going to get around this other corner. And that's basically your last 5K of the race. Push yourself. Just give it everything. Just don't listen to your body wanting to fail you. Just keep going. And so I was thinking as you're talking, even we need to start to recognize that kind of stuff and ask ourselves, okay, when is the moment where, I remember I was talking to a friend and his kids were really small. I think they were all under 3 or something like that. And I was like, man, push in now. This is the time. Do some extra hours of work, do what you need to try and get your debts paid off and stuff. Because the reality is later your kids are going to be more active. They're going to be in more things and you're going to want to be more present. Well, they're sleeping most of the time or taking, 2 or 3 naps a day. That's a good time to press in to try and build up your nest egg a little bit. And I think in ministry and in life, we have seasons too, where we have to recognize those. I remember, when we were going through this season of burnout, some friends stopped me and they're like, remember, you have 2 small children. You have a lot of stuff that you're doing. And they just kind of pointed out to me okay, this is a hard time. And I was blessed to have a supervisor at the time who had older kids. And so he was able to say, man, I remember those years. Those are some of the hardest years of ministry we had, was when we had little children that weren't in school yet. And so I think if we all can recognize that, those seasons and have people around us that are encouraging us to remind us of those seasons, even the example of the marathon runners, they have coaches, they have preparation, they have people on the sideline that are reminding them of where they're at and how far they've gone. And those are all indicators that help us push. And I think in missions work and in ministry work in general, we don't have some of those same indicators because we don't know when someone's fully discipled. We don't know when something's fully finished. And so it takes a lot more effort to try and understand and be present with the times that we're in to understand, okay, is this a season where we just need to slow down? And is this a season where we need to fill up the schedule and have lots of stuff to press into? And I think a lot of that happens in community when we have other people speaking in to the decisions we're making or can give an outside perspective and or who have simply already traveled that road and can tell us, hey, this is what you have ahead of you. So pace yourself or press in now, because later you're not going to be able to push as hard. And
yeah, I can echo that, Jesse. I didn't know you back then, but I remember also struggling when we had the 2 little kids, and my mentor connected me with more seasoned pastors whose children are older, and every time I told them how old my kids were, they're like, "Oh, I remember those years." Nobody could give me like a word of comfort of like or strategy. They would just be like, you just have to uh, you know run through it and eventually it'll get easier. And actually that was helpful, as it didn't make the situation necessarily, didn't change the circumstances, but it made it easier to go through it, knowing that the course was like that.
Yeah, in sports in general, they talk about there's only so much of your physical strength. At some point, it becomes a lot of mental strength, right? And so when you have someone saying, "Hey, you just got to bear with it, put your mouth guard in, and keep going," that's helpful in itself, because then you can mentally know how to fight. I'm wondering if there's anything we can leave the listeners with as we start to wrap up, thinking in light of those different situations. So thinking in light of the people that have maybe been through burnout and they're on the other side, how can we encourage them? If there are people who are right now feel like they're in burnout, what can we kind of encourage them with? And then those who maybe are just now starting this journey into being in ministers, wherever they're going to be, maybe in their passport country, or maybe they're coming to serve in a cross-cultural context. Some pointers that we might be able to give them in those different scenarios.
I would start with saying that it's not the end. Burnout doesn't mean that ministry is over. Just like when moral failure happens or other sinful things, obviously it doesn't mean you get back right into it. And there's a process. So should burnout. Burnout should have a process. And obviously, if your mission agency or whatever you're working with doesn't have that process, then I would go look for other places that can kind of help you work through it. If you felt like you are still called into the ministry, but this burnout is in the midst of it, I would encourage you to let you know that it's not the end. Failures happen in all sorts of walks of life, and the goal is to, in Christ, be reinforced, encouraged, and get back into the game.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's not the end. I think that's too often we do feel like it is the end, at least when you're in the middle of it, right? You feel like it's never going to end. I would encourage those that are starting off to not discount the on-ramp. Sometimes I feel like when people are just landed in their place of ministry or just started the job, there's this zeal to get going and wanting to do the work that they've been either being prepared for or have been convinced that that's what they need to do. And so I would just encourage people to pace themselves at the beginning, because pretty soon it's going to be overwhelming. There's a reason why the Lord said, that the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. At some point, you feel that in ministry, that there's lots of stuff to do and not enough people to do it. And so when you're just starting off, you have that kind of new kid on the block pass, and you can kind of take your time to get up to speed. And so I'd encourage those, take time to really get to know the culture, the language, the places that you're being, the organization that you're working with, before you really push hard into taking on responsibilities for ministries and teams that you might have to lead.
Yeah, and to finish the verse, the answer is not, and so work harder. The work is with you, and so work harder. No, it's actually pray for more people to come. And
that's a good point.
That's the Lord's answer, not to work harder, to pray to the Lord of the harvest. Yeah. And if I could add just one last thing, this is more like advice. I'm not saying this is set in stone. Compartmentalizing things can at times be not good, but in some cases, it's actually good to be able to kind of separate, for example, ministry, not to have a spillover where every time you're with your wife or your family, that's all you talk about. Or if you enjoy a sport, you feel like, oh man, this is the time that I have to evangelize. This is part of the ministry. Obviously, if God uses those things, those are great, but sometimes you just kind of need to have your own space, a place where you can thrive and not feel like the thing that's kind of bringing you down feels like it's overspilling on other areas. So if you can have a place where you could kind of disconnect yourself in a healthy way, it's good to have something, a hobby, figure something out where you can just don't think about it, connecting it to ministry, to work. Like, this is something I just want to do. And the reality is that you have to find the thing that kind of revives you. Like for me, vacations don't really do that. I enjoy vacations because I'm with the family, but a lot of times I come back more stressed, more tired because of all the work that's piled up and all the running around we had to do. So something that actually can refresh you.
Those are all great things, and yeah, hopefully this has been helpful to you. We really appreciate you tuning in today to this episode on burnout, and we hope that you enjoyed the conversation, that you found it insightful. Your ministry is important to us, and we hope that you consider your time with us an investment in the work that you do. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends. And until next time, keep going wherever Jesus leads.